So we continue with 1123 of the series, Heidegger. It's 6:15, so we'll be getting dark soon here. We're out in the area called Lindom, outside of it. I don't remember the name. It's not Torkulla, it's the other place. We went into the Klein bottle as illustrated by Ryan, 1974, page 111. That it is an inner dimensional subject. The process that took place in alchemical vessels were often described as circular distillation, a transformative circulation of substances that was in some way turned back upon itself. It is the fluid Kleinian circulation from contained object to containing space, back to uncontained subject, that unites the reflective and the pre-reflective in an embodiment of ontological paradox. The Euroboric Klein bottle is a reflector upon content that, in containing itself, flows unbrokenly back into its own pre-reflective ground. That ground is the Klein bottle's missing dimension. We may indeed say that all reflected upon contents originates in the pre-reflective, but in the case of an ordinary content, we cannot move back into its ground without obstruction, because this content appears simply contained, closed into its spatial container in such a way that it's closed off from its pre-reflective source. This is when you go round the Klein bottle. Only a self-containing object or reflection can incorporate its pre-reflective origin without a break. Goes to show for the necessity of the Klein bottle. It should be clear by now that we cannot end the ruler reflection merely by attempting to break with it, since such breaking is itself reflective in nature. This realization finds expression in the general strategy I have employed: to abide in the reflective mode, to carry out the concretization of ontological paradox within reflection's own province. By thus challenging reflection from within itself, by following its very own trajectory, we have arrived at its inner horizon, its natural point of termination, its true end. Of course, the true end of reflection cannot merely be an end, since it would then be but the outcome of reflection. For reflection truly to end, we must have paradox, an end that is not an end, a boundary that's not a boundary, and it is this that is the embodied in the Klein bottle. At the inner horizon or boundaryless boundary of reflection, we flow beyond reflection, engage in the pre-reflective, while yet continuing to reflect in superseding reflection from within itself. We never break contact with it, like the movement from one side of the Möbius strip to the other, that paradoxically keeps us on the same side. Our Kleinian movement from reflection to pre-reflectivity at once maintains the reflective, but now, instead of one-sided domination by reflection, there is harmony with the pre-reflective. This is the only solution. We cannot get away or into the idea of pre-reflection without the Klein bottle. Actually, already the Möbius strip is here incredibly helpful. It makes it possible to fathom, to get into the understanding how we can get around and away from the very limitation that otherwise will immediately pose itself. Without those figures of speech and without an actual real thing to hold, to touch, to be tangible, that is utterly impossible. It's very important to understand. We continue with the next paragraph. Making paradox a concrete reality. I hasten to admit that the foregoing words about the Kleinian embodiment of ontological paradox may themselves seem rather disembodied. What can we do to make them more concrete? As a first step, let me acknowledge that until now I implicitly have been assuming the very classical posture I have explicitly sought to question. As noted above, in the classical situation of object before subject, only the object is open to view. The subject remains detached, out of reach, anonymous. And this is essentially how I have approached the object of central concern in my essay. Versus Wholeness. In maintaining my own anonymity, in failing to situate myself in this text as the subject before whom wholeness is cast, I have let it appear as a free-floating abstraction. Then it seems that if I am truly to challenge the classical stance, I must make wholeness less remote by recognizing in explicit terms that, rather than standing before some anonymous subject, it stands before this subject, that it too say wholeness is the content of this text. It appears before me. I am stating it appears before me, the one who writes these words, and before you who reads them. To be sure, I am stating the obvious, but it is precisely the obvious that we lose sight of when we are lost in abstraction. Thus, brought down to earth, the question of realizing wholeness, of embodying ontological paradox through the Klein bottle, becomes one of whether this text we are working with, being Kleinian in character, can lead us back into the pre-reflective ground from which this reflection of ours originates, and can do so without a break, thereby surmounting the exclusive role of reflection. The classical text operates squarely within the reflective mode, and raises no question about doing so. Here the word or sign, whose signifier serves as surrogate for the subject, refers solely to what is other, making this signifier object of reflection explicit, a well-bounded content closed into its context. The signifier subject per se remains implicit. It does not meaningfully refer to itself. Is classical reflection effectively challenged in modernist or postmodern deconstruction writing? I suggest it is not. Should be a drama trumpet here or violins playing hard. I absolutely agree. I would say postmodernism and modernism are sheer continuations. Failing to see them as continuations will lock you into the same position as before. It is true that the modernist sign is self-referential. In modernism, attention is withdrawn from the end products of reflection, and meaning is relocated in an abstraction of the process itself. We see this in intensely self-involved psychological works such as James Joyce's Ulysses. In fact, we may say that modernism as such is psychological. It seeks to apply logos to the psyche. Very good. Thank you, Stephen M. Rosen. I.e. to gain explicit knowledge of subjectivity. Here the sign is turned back upon itself so as to bring to light what formerly had been strictly implicit. In the language of psychoanalysis, that exemplar of modernism, the goal is to make the unconscious conscious. Stated most essentially, modernism wants to turn the classical subject into an object. In carrying out this program, does modernism genuinely surpass classicism? What actually happens is that classicism is preserved at a higher level of abstraction. Just when it comes to Einstein, by inferring a fourth dimension, we move the problem upside, then at least momentarily out of view. But does it stay out of view forever? I think not. It's bound to turn up again. For in making the old subject explicit, in rendering it a well-delineated content enclosed in its context, this object near subject implicitly must appear before a new higher order subject. The self-reflection of modernism is indeed akin to gazing at the reflection of one's eye in a mirror. What had been the gaze of the subject now itself appears as an object gazed upon by a subject that is one step removed from the original. The important thing to recognize is that this transformation of terms leaves completely intact the classical relationship of object in space before subject. Wow. That's a hefty criticism. Bye-bye modernism, bye-bye postmodernism. And even to perceive them as enemies or threats, it's an exaggeration and a danger in itself. Should listen to that, Father Thomas. Modernism thus poses no fundamental challenge to classicism. Modernism's self-referential sign, by turning the self into another, in fact maintains in abstraction the classical split between self and other, between the signifier and its signified object. Of course, the very same thing always goes for any other movement. Might it be existentialism in the words of Sartre or Camus, or why not psychologism by Freud or Jung, or why not, what do we have? New Age, the hippie movement, Gary Zukov, Fritjof Capra, Dana Zohar, I think was now one name, who had a quantum soul or something. They all reinstated the subject-object division, and thereby making it even more cemented. I think the pointing arrow should go to people proponents of Buddhism. Tartan Tulku himself indirectly admitted the subject-object division always reinforces itself in Western thinking, and introducing Tibetan Buddhism to the scenario makes it even sterner. In postmodernism, the ultimate consequence of modernism is recognized and played out. The crux of postmodernism, I suggest, is the realization that modernism's objectification of the subject is but the first term of an infinite regress. We have seen that in modernism the classical object loses its privileged position as an unquestionable base of knowledge, as the transcendent, never to be viewed perspective point from which all else is viewed. Once this subject is viewed, made explicit, objectified, cast before the perspective point of a newly implied higher order subject, no subject can securely hold its position. Having established that the classical subject can be turned into an object, the new modernist subject should be susceptible to the same fate. The objectification of that subject would bring a still newer order of subjectivity with the same susceptibility, and so ad infinitum. And each time the subject is undermined by being made into an object, what had been object to that subject is also undermined. Ultimately then, we have neither subject nor object in any stable, abidingly meaningful form. In the parlance of postmodern literary theory, the fixed relationships between particular signifiers and their signified meanings give way to the restless, ever-shifting text, the ceaselessly self-alienated application of the sign to itself. Thus Spivak, echoing the outlook of Derrida, says that, quote, sign will always lead to sign, one substituting the other as signifier and signified in turn. In Derrida's own words, knowledge must be understood as a field of free play, that is to say, a field of infinite substitutions, in which identity fragments into sheer difference. I'm proposing that the specific way this takes place is by recursive process of self-referential mirroring, in which time and again the signified subject is displaced by being made into the signified object of a newly implicit subject. Therefore, if we view the self-reflection of modernism as a mirroring that maintains in abstraction the classical relation of object in space before subject, postmodernism would then constitute an infinite repetition of this mirroring, one that maintains classical identity in such a way that, in the end, it also negates it. The field of infinite substitutions, constitutive of the postmodern text, the infinite regress of science within science within science, is reminiscent of the old Ptolemaic epicycles. How very good! When the ancient Greek notion that heavenly bodies traverse perfectly circular orbits was called into question by new observations of the planets, instead of gracefully relinquishing the paradigm of the circle, it was perpetuated for centuries in an artificial, ultimately unconvincing form. The orbits of planets were described in terms of epicycles, complex arrangements of circles within circles that gratuitously replicate the image of the circle. Today, the challenge to the status quo appears far greater than it was in Ptolemaios' time. What is now being called into question is no mere image we can reflect upon, but the reflective posture itself, that expressed in the relation of object in space before subject. Unable to let go of this deeply ingrained habit of comportment, postmodernism carries it forward in its infinite regress of science. The sterility of this is not lost on postmodernism. In their abstract self-reflections there is a distinct mood of disenchantment. Yet, because the postmodern writer can find meaning nowhere else, the rule of reflection lingers on, albeit in this negatively, though self-subverting manner. An alternative to postmodernism is intimidated in Eugene Gendlin's expansion upon Heidegger. Gendlin 1993 offers us a text that can reflect upon its bodily pre-reflective source. Speaking is a special case of bodily living, says Gendlin. Our bodies perform the implicit functions essential to language. Our bodies imply our linguistic meanings. Moreover, when we speak or write, the pre-linguistic source of this activity is not simply left behind. It continues to operate in the very midst of our linguistic functioning. Thus, for example, the most sophisticated details of linguistic situation can make our bodies uncomfortable. Could we not reflect explicitly upon the pre-reflective source of our reflection? Let us attempt such an act of self-reflection here, with the very words of this page. If Gendlin is correct, our reading of these words arises from our bodies, and since the pre-linguistic source goes on functioning even as our words now turn back upon it, it seems we should be able to realize that the source in the bodily way, so that our words no longer appear as mere abstractions. This is what Gendlin means when he proclaims that words can say how they work. They work from the body, and becoming cognizant of their own bodily underpinning, they can link back to it. As in Gendlin's approach, the words of the postmodern text do reflect upon themselves, but only as words, disembodied signs ultimately devoid of meaning. Gendlin points us beyond postmodernism. In Gendlin's form of self-reflection, the text is not merely conscious of itself as text, but calls attention to the concrete, pretextual process from which it originates. Only by gaining access to the pretextual, the pre-reflective, can we supersede the old trichotomy of object in space before subject and approach embodied wholeness. In Gendlin's terms, the pre-reflective is the pre-separated. That is, it comes before, is more primordial than the divisions arising in classicism, and perpetuated... Oh, sorry. Stör jag när jag pratar eller? Pratar jag för högt?
Nej, jag bara undrar vad det var. Spelar du in?
Jag spelar in, men det gör inget om ni är med.
Jag vill inte vara med. Men vi ska mötas, så här kommer väl lite folk.
Jaha, då flyttar jag på mig.
Nej, du behöver inte.
Jaha.
Jag stänger här och så går vi in och grejar lite.
Ja, men vad snällt.
Ja.
Tackar och
Får jag
bugar.
fråga vad det är du spelar in?
Jag spelar
Vad
text
mysigt.
här.
Jag är så ny.
Det är lite filosofi här. Så det handlar om geometri och lite sådana grejer. Och en fantastisk flaska som heter Klein Bottle. Som går in i sig själv. Nej, den är väldigt ovanlig. Det finns bara 2 i Sverige.
Och hur får man in något i den? Den går bara i sig
Det
själv.
går att fylla i den alltså, men den har ingen volym. Så den är mycket märklig, ja.
Ha det så trevligt.
Ska jag sänka mig lite grann eller?
Nej.
Hej. Ja. Stort tack. In Gendlin terms, the pre-reflective is pre-separated. That is, it comes before, is more primordial than the divisions arising in classicism and perpetuated in modernism and postmodernism. Yet a gap may remain between our reflection upon the pre-reflective and the pre-reflective itself. And where there are gaps, there is continuing rule of reflection. I venture to propose that a Kleinian rendition of Gendling's text would be needed to close the gap. First, let me emphasize that our postmodern text must be paradoxical in character, just like Heraclitus, I will remember. This is my comment. Again, what we are seeking to do is to include in this reflection of ours the pre-reflective source of our activity, the subtext that normally is kept strictly implicit. This text is to draw back upon itself, make reference to itself without alienating itself. As happens with modernist and postmodern text, in so signifying itself, our text cannot merely turn itself into another that is cast before a newly implied, more abstract self. So we don't have this continual process of epicycles of representing, represented, and so on. Does this mean that the self that is signified must be the same self that is doing the signifying? Yes and no. If the self in question was simply the same, our reflection would collapse into mere self-identity. As long as we're engaged in reflection and are working with the text, are writing or speaking and not merely remaining silent, there can be no simple self-identity. Yet even though the very act of reflecting upon the self turns it into another, it is possible for this other to flow right back into the same self from which it arises, rather than appearing merely as an other cast before a new self. Thus, the self-reflection I am describing would give us neither self nor other, in the categorical sense of these terms. We would realize instead that paradoxical interpenetration, and this is what we require to supersede the supremacy of reflective predication. Signifier and signified would be more than reciprocally interdependent in such a self-reflective text. They would be identified, utterly one, yet they also would be two. By virtue of the later aspects, reflection would continue. By virtue of the former, the pre-separated, pre-reflected dimension would be brought into play. This is the saying that saves us from eternal epicycles, which the solution always have to be postmodernism. There is no other escape from that. It is a destiny, and this is the first clue how to that destiny can be avoided. And not only avoided, it will open up for a even more stable self. But there is no chance of a self in postmodernism nor modernism. And of course, as we already seen, in classical view there is no self at all. No wonder that the self has been preemptively killed off. I would say that is the mass suicide of modern culture. That was the end of religion as we know it in the Western Hemisphere. That was the death of God, as Nietzsche calls it. That was the death of knowledge, as Karl Popper shows it, and so forth. However, for the gap between reflection and the pre-reflective thus to be closed, the paradoxical return of signification to itself requires a signifier that possesses sufficient dimensionality. Enter here the Klein bottle. Yes! Our work with this structure clearly is no exercise in pure mathematics, in which a mathematical object is signified by a definition or algebraic formula. For us, the Klein bottle is not merely a signified object, It is a signifier, one that indeed paradoxically signifies itself. It is the dimensionality of the signifier that permits us to close the gap between the reflective and the pre-reflective. It's just amazing. We have seen that classical reflection takes place in a context not exceeding 3 exterior dimensions. And I have proposed that if we do not indulge ourselves in higher order extrapolations. Nu kommer folk, jag flyttar över, ska vi se.
Jag ska säga att du är journalist.
Haha, gör det!
Ta nu och gör en back.
So we soldier on here with the text. Yet a gap may remain between our reflection upon the pre-reflective and the pre-reflective itself. And where there are gaps, there is the continuing rule of reflection. I venture to propose that the Kleinian rendition of Janlin's text would be needed to close the gap. First, let me emphasize that our postmodern text must be paradoxical in character. Again, what we are seeking to do is to include in this reflection of ours the pre-reflective source of our activity, the subtext that normally is kept strictly implicit. This text is to draw back upon itself, make reference to itself without alienating itself, as happened with modernist and postmodernist text. In so signifying itself, our text cannot merely turn itself into an other that is cast before a newly implied, more abstract self. I had my own conundrum with this when I was very young, thinking about reflecting upon something, and I realized somewhere you couldn't have both reflected upon and reflection. So reflected, I think I ended up with only the object, thus taking away the subject. That was the only solution I can find to the problem until now, I would say. This solves it, and this is the first time I really so explicitly hear a solution. I read the text before, but this last 5-6 paragraphs, their understanding has always eluded me. By the softening up we done before, now the understanding comes to fore. This is actually the solution to the postmodernism cul-de-sac. No other solution is possible, which is also really important to understand. There is no other way out of this. There cannot be. Any other way out is just a way of reinforcing the division and making the subject into an object, and making the whole matter much worse than it was at the outset. And I think this is a much better explanation of Stephen M Rosen than the one often given by Jordan Peterson. Steven Pinker said rationality must be heightened up. No, already in the classical view there was a massive problem never to be solved within his own paradigm. This is the solution, and it's not even a way out. The way is inside, so it's not an alternative. The Kleinian bottle is in itself a contained and uncontained thing. So you see why the Klein bottle is the only solution, because it doesn't add anything extra like modernism, postmodernism. It doesn't seem to be an escape route as Jordan Peterson or Steven Pinker, or for that matter many other thinkers. And this also shows why stride into solipsism done by Bertrand Russell, Bernardo Kastrup, or a jump into many worlds, which is actually a solution to this problem as well. And I think that's the most forceful reason why many world interpretation came before, by Hugh Everett and Max Tegmark. All those problems, all those solutions to the problem, so to speak, will eventually disappear the more we understand the Klein bottle. And this also shows that Gendlin's solution is halfway a solution. It's very good so far though, it's fantastic. But together with the Klein bottle, it becomes a complete solution. It cures the problem. Yet, yeah, how can I look at something as Descartes thought? The thinking about something that you look upon was the same thing as himself. Cogito ergo sum. And most modern philosophers, this is the cause also of representationalism, which is not an ideology, but a resource of the classical approach, taken one step further. For every step you take it further, the more you block out any other solutions. But there are no other solutions. It has to come from within, and it doesn't really changes anything. We can still continue with whatever we were doing before. It's a very nice feature, but not the most important. Does this mean that the self that is signified must be the same self that is doing the signifying? Yes and no. If the self in question was simply the same, our reflection would collapse into mere self-identity. As long as we're engaged in reflection, are working with the text, are writing or speaking and not merely remaining silent, there can be no simple self-identity. Yet even though the very act of reflecting upon the self turns into another, it is possible for this other to flow right back into the same self from which it arises, rather than appearing merely as an other cast before a new self. Thus the self-reflection I am describing would give us neither self nor other. In categorical sense of these terms, we would realize instead their paradoxical interpretation. And this is what we require to supersede the supremacy of reflective predication. Signifier and signified would be more than reciprocally interdependent in such a self-reflective text. They would be identified, utterly one, yet they also would be two. By virtue of the latter aspect, reflection would continue. By virtue of the former, the pre-separated pre-reflective dimension would be brought into play. However, for the gap between reflection and the pre-reflective thus to be closed, the paradoxical return of signification to itself requires a signifier that possesses sufficient dimensionality. Enter here the Klein bottle. Our work with this structure clearly is no exercise in pure mathematics, in which a mathematical object is signified by a definition or algebraic formula. For us, the Klein bottle is not merely a signified object, it is a signifier. One that indeed paradoxically signifies itself. How gallant. It is the dimensionality of this signifier that permits us to close the gap between the reflective and the pre-reflective. It has dimensions. Neither dimension are not to be found within postmodernism, modernism, or the classical view. Neither any other view. Dimensions are here entering. And it's much easier to see here how dimensions are entering than in, for instance, if we look at directly at quantum mechanics. But this is a way also into quantum mechanics, because that confirms the problem of pre-reflection contra reflection. We have seen that classical reflection takes place in a context not exceeding 3 exterior dimensions, and I have proposed that if we do not indulge ourselves in higher order extrapolations of reflected dimensionality in the fashion of modernism, postmodernism, the 4th dimension is the pre-reflective one that engages our inwardness. Of course, this bare statement about the pre-reflective in itself is merely the reflective. The pre-reflective 4th dimension is the content of our predication, but that abstract content is simply contained as what we reflect upon in the closed linguistic space of our discourse. From here, we cannot pass smoothly to concrete pre-reflectivity itself. This limitation derives from the fact that the signifiers we use to convey our 4th dimensional content themselves lack sufficient dimensionality. By themselves, these words, the one-dimensional marks printed on this 2-dimensional paper surface, are indeed inadequate to make reality of ontological paradox. They are but arbitrarily devised, conventionally agreed upon tokens that refer to their content in a merely external manner. The concretization of a paradox I have carried out in this essay has effected an increase in the dimension of the signifier. We went from mere words of paradox, I am not I, to its Necker cube and Möbius strip expansions. With each step, the dimensionality of the signifier increased, and our expression of paradox became more internally embodied. But we were still working with mere symbols, reflectors whose pre-reflective content in fact remained abstract, being contained within our field of reflection. Only with a higher dimensional Kleinian reflector can we surpass the primacy of reflection, for only the Klein bottle signifies the 4th pre-reflective dimension by signifying itself. I hope you get it by now. If not, you will soon. It is the Euroboric movement of the Klein bottle back into itself that produces the whole in it. It's going back into itself as the Ouroboros, and then we have a whole, but we also have wholeness. Whole and wholeness, since this opening is the mark of self-signification. With it, the classical gap between signified and signifier, in fact, should be closed. With a whole in the Kleinian text, we should at once have wholeness. However, this will not happen if we continue to assume a reflective posture in our relation to our text. In that case, the whole will appear as merely a hole, a breach in the text that renders it incomplete. Clearly then, we must change our posture, approach the Kleinian text in a different way. Specifically, what way? How can we overcome the old compelling tendency to turn whatever we signify into an object of reflection appearing out there, before us, simply contained with its context and thus set apart from us? What must we do to allow the self-containing Kleinian signifier to signify itself by flowing right back into us? I am proposing that the Kleinian text in truth cannot be simply contained. In containing itself, the Klein bottle should spill over the bounds of the context that would enclose it, flow backwards to its own four-dimensional ground, our ground. We who read this text, yes, as Genlin would say, the pre-linguistic source of these words continues to operate as we read them, and with the dimensional enhancement of these paradoxical words that fleshes them out, makes them concrete, the gap between this reflection on the pre-reflective and its living source should indeed be closed. Thus, in properly completing our Kleinian discourse, this text we read would live within us as it stands before us, and would do so without interruption. But I ask again, how must we approach our text to complete it in this way? Although the long prevalent habit of classical reflection strongly disposes us to approaching the Klein bottle as but an object of predication, this object does not lend itself to being predicated thus. The inherent character of the Klein bottle suggests that we adopt a higher dimensional, i.e. pre-reflective approach to it. This means, as Genlin would say, that we are to obtain a moody understanding, a Stimmung, or a felt sense of our Kleinian text, a bodily cognizance that exceeds this text as mere content we reflect upon. The felt sense, of course, is the pre-reflective awareness. It should be true that we could gain such a sense of any text, since all texts originate in this pre-reflective, in the pre-reflective. But when the text appears closed off into its context, and thus closed off from its pre-reflective source, its subtext, the gap between the reflective and the pre-reflective will persist. In the case of the Kleinian text, there can be no pretense that it is categorically divided from its subtext, for as a text it is incomplete. To complete it, we must follow its own constitutes, its own natural trajectory into higher dimension, into the living subjectivity that constitutes the origin of our reflection upon it. In this way, the Kleinian text comes alive, stands within us as well as before us. Our task is to surpass the long dominant habit of predication, so that in one unbroken movement we may pass from a reflective understanding of the pre-reflective ground of this text to the ground itself. The Klein bottle uniquely mediates this surpassing. The hole in the Kleinian text is the perfect size and shape for our inwardness, and like a black hole in space, a break in classical continuum, it draws us toward it, extending to us a pregnant invitation to fill it with holes of ourselves. To put it differently, we may say that our Kleinian text requires us to perform a kind of meditation upon it, though we may be strongly inclined to approach it by means of conventional symbolic operations. The Klein bottle itself suggests we do otherwise. We are called on to experience it, not just through perception or conception, but through proprioception. Listen carefully. Proprioception. Etymologically, to perceive is to take hold of, or take through, from the Latin per, through, and capere, to take. And to conceive is to gather or take in. It is through the perceptual and the conceptual activity that we work with the ordinary, simple, contained text. The term proprioceptive is from the Latin proprius, meaning one's own. Literally, then, proprioception means taking one's own, which can be read as taking of self or self-taking. The term finds its most common usage in physiology, where it signifies an organism's sensitivity to activity in its own muscles, joints and tendons. But the philosopher-physicist David Bohm spoke of the need for proprioceptive knowledge, or proprioceptive thought. Bohm saw this as a meditative act in which consciousness becomes aware of its own implicate activity, in which its content originates. Years earlier, the social psychiatrist Trigon Borov had spoken similarly of the need for human beings to gain proprioceptive awareness of the organismic basis of their divisive symbolic activity. What I am proposing here is that proprioception is the appropriate way to work with the Klein bottle, and that it is what the self-containing Klein bottle requires and invites. In thinking this Kleinian text, we must think proprioceptively, think our own thinking. In my sense of the term, proprioception would not entail a realization of the self that cleanly transcends all symbolic operations. It would not lead to a state of pure consciousness in which all relations to objects are left behind, like the project meditation practice in Southern School of Chinese Zen. No, Kleinian proprioception would not just involve sheer non-discrimination, but non-discrimination, discriminating discrimination, to cite Suzuki again. This kind of proprioception is not undertaken instead of perception and conception. Symbolic activity continues. It is this that we call proprioceive. So we never take away the symbolic or the signifying. We never go to pure or sheer transcendence. We don't do, as is suggested in New Age, take the thoughts away or the signifiers, or take talking away, language away, or doing like Plato, saying writing is worse than words, and meaning is the purest of all, like Saussure is inclining. No, this is something completely different, and it's contained within. And we keep them all, but we heal them from within. This is the re-entering of the inner, the first time that the inner puts its feet upon the world. And I would say this is not a material world only. This is the world of abstraction as well. This is what it is to proprioceive, to have the body make a dual, triple, quadruple understanding, not taking anything away, allowing for all levels. not making a lobotomy that usually suggested in modern meditation, where thought should be erased or burned out. That is the equivalent of putting and burning electrode up your neurons, up your nose, to burn off and make you a lobotomy convict. I've seen too many of the sort of victims of this thinking being more or less apathic or catatonic after years of meditation, burning up the neurons in this striving in a sort of postmodernistic new age / trial at getting rid of reflection. Well, then at the same time getting rid of the world involuntarily at the same time. The Klein bottle is and will always be the only solution, because that's the only solution from within. All the other solutions are solutions from without, where you add things. You add a Zen Buddhist ideology, you add an idea of Fritjof Capra or the dancing Wuli masters. They're all from external, they're all external. They're all text from externality. This is from within, within what you're already thinking. And in a way it doesn't even add anything. It makes more room possible. And all of a sudden space come into your head. And it's like this incredible headache is dissipating. And there is a peace coming about. Not a Oriental New Agey peace that means lobotomy or the burning out of the soul and the world, or the catatonia I've seen so many times in